Good evening and thanks for being part of tonight's Melbourne Conversations. The event is Building a Sustainable Melbourne. My name is Councillor Arron Wood, Chair of the Environment Portfolio at the City of Melbourne, and I've got the pleasure of being your moderator this evening. Our panellists, I'm going to introduce them a little bit more fully in just a moment, but they are Dr. Aggarwalla, who is the Special Advisor to C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, Rob Bennett from Ecodistricts Portland, and Pascale, Mittermaier, Director of Sustainability of Lease Construction, Jane Henley, CEO of the World Green Building Council. So just give them a round of applause. So Green Cities is an annual event which brings together property owners, designers, architects, planners, community leaders and policymakers. It allows them to share leading practice that will create better buildings and spaces, allowing people to connect and create positive impacts for our environment. After 2 years in Sydney, it's great to see the event has come back to the better city in Australia and sparked conversations such as this one. This Melbourne Conversations event is a great chance to bring together renowned international guests, as we have on our panel, and world leaders in sustainability to discuss ways cities can achieve the ambitious targets they have set. As one of those cities, Melbourne has been working extremely hard to achieve a sustainable city. We're really proud recently to become carbon neutral for our own operations, but we're only less than 1% of the emissions in our city. So the task ahead of us with zero net emissions by 2020 is great, and we need to work with our partners, our businesses, our industry, and certainly our residents to reach that target. As part of these strategies, the Zero Net Emissions Strategy and also Total Watermark, which focuses on our water resource, we do have a 25% renewable energy target by the year 2018, which I'm extremely proud of. It's an ambitious target, but it's a target which I think that we can reach. As the demands of urbanisation accelerate, we need to keep talking about solutions such as these for sustainable cities, and we need to work with all sectors towards these goals. Melbourne is a unique city, but our challenges are not dissimilar to those being felt by other cities across the globe. That's why it's so important to have our international guests, to have the Green Cities Conference talking about these issues all of this week. I was fortunate enough to represent the City of Melbourne at Johannesburg at the C40 Leadership Summit. And what was abundantly clear was that we need to project this conversation globally, that this isn't just something that one city is facing. In fact, the 63 cities in the C40 leadership group are all facing very similar sorts of issues. By sharing intelligence and learning from what other cities are doing, we can improve our approach at the grassroots level. The exchange of solutions across the world will assist Melbourne's transition. So, without any further delay, I'd like to give a little bit more detail about our panel members. Jane Henley leads the world's largest business organisation, influencing the green building marketplace with over 25,000 company members. As Chief Executive Officer, Jane's role is to drive collaboration between 100 national green building councils and advocate for green building as a mechanism to deliver environmental, economic and social benefits. Jane's background in business development sets a positive entrepreneurial agenda for transforming the building sector towards sustainability. Dr. Aggarwalla works with the Bloomberg Associates, advising no less than Mike Bloomberg on his appointment as the city's ambassador for the UN. He was a special advisor to the chair of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and he led the development and implementation of Plan YC, which was Mayor Michael Bloomberg's long-term sustainability plan for New York City. Rob Bennett is the founding CEO of Ecodistricts, and he's a recognised leader in sustainable cities movement with 16 years of direct experience shaping municipal sustainable development projects and policy at the intersection of city planning, real estate development, economic development and environmental policy. Pascale Mittermaier is responsible for Lease Europe's overall sustainability strategy and implementation across the major business areas, including retail assets, development projects and construction activities. Lease is the heart of some of the biggest urban regeneration projects in Europe. So, let's hear from our panellists. Actually, I feel a little bit like Parkinson sitting here. Rit, please kick us off with your reflections on the topic.
All right. Well, thanks, Councillor, and it's very exciting for me to be here. It's my first visit to Melbourne, but I feel like I know the city very well because Melbourne has been such an active participant in the C40 cities. So I think one of the things that I'll start off by saying is I think this city projects itself very well on the world stage when it comes to climate action, given all that you've done, given the great leadership that you've had under a couple of mayors and active leadership in the council, which I think we've learned from in New York, we've learned from across the board at the C40, and that's very exciting. I'll make three quick observations based on my experience in New York and with the C40. One is that this is, as the councillor said, a global movement of cities that have very similar challenges. Every individual city is different, of course, but the similarities are that the city scale is a scale where you can make a concrete difference relatively quickly. You know, national governments tend to fall into much more ideological debates around climate or any other issue, but at the city level, people get very pragmatic, they get local. We had a former mayor of New York in the 20th century who said, there's no Republican or Democrat way to pick up the garbage. And it's that kind of pragmatism that gets you out of ideological disputes that I think is one of the reasons that cities have moved forward. And you see that in places like Melbourne, you see that in New York, you see that in Portland, you see that in Europe, all over the place. The second thing is we definitely see this picking up steam. Right? The C40, one of the things we do is a biennial survey of what cities are doing around the world on issues related to sustainability and climate change. And we have seen in the last 2 years a doubling of the number of policies, programs, and initiatives that have been put in place across the C40. It's really remarkable. We've cataloged 8,000 separate actions that the 63 cities in the C40 have done. 41% of them in the last 2 years alone. Right? So what you see is a dramatic uptake in what cities are doing. And what they are also doing is they are stealing good ideas without shame and with great glee. Right? And that is fantastic because, again, you've always got to modify ideas when they travel from city to city. Nothing works in a cookie-cutter way. But what you can do is take the lessons from other cities and adopt them quite quickly. We've seen that. 2 years ago, there were 6 cities in the world that had bike-sharing programs. Today, in fact, as of late last year when we did this survey, there are 36 cities in the C40 alone that have bike-sharing programs. And it's not just something as relatively quick to do as bike sharing. Another trend we see is the expansion of ideas from the southern hemisphere, and I guess I have to say that with an asterisk here. We're increasingly using that term to mean what used to be developing countries or emerging markets. But from south to north, and the best example of that is bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit, of course, 40 years ago invented in Brazil, was for a long time considered to be kind of the poor man's version of a subway. Today, more than half of all the operating BRT systems in the world are in the developed countries. Right, so this is something that we are learning from the emerging markets. And the final thing I'll say is that another phenomenon we see all over the world, and I think will be quite relevant here in Australia, is the fact that the cities have consistently been driving national governments. It's not the national governments that have led on this issue. It's the cities. We've seen that in the United States, and in fact, when we were doing urban work, working with cities together across the U.S. to make the point to the world that the Bush administration did not represent all Americans, right? I thought it was just an American phenomenon, but it's not. Mexico City drove Mexico's policies. Rio and Sao Paulo pushed the Brazilian government to be more aggressive on this. The Seoul metropolitan government was far ahead of the Korean government 5 or 6 years ago and got the Korean government to move more aggressively. And what I think that demonstrates is that because you can do things in a local scale, you can see the benefits quickly on the ground, you get it out of the ideology, you can then demonstrate to the rest of the country and to the national leaders that this isn't something to fight about, this is something to just get done.
Thank you, Rit. I think you'd make the Lord Mayor of Melbourne very, very happy with those opening remarks. I think there was a comment at C40 about cities inheriting the earth, and Robert Doyle was very happy to read that. So I think your opening remarks are very poignant in terms of how the global scale is looking. Pascale?
Oh, thank you, and hi, everyone. We spent a lot of time in the last couple days at the Green Cities Conference talking about how we should shamelessly steal from one another and take the ideas from one city that work and apply them in the other. And there's a great willingness to do that. I thought I would just give an analogy that I think is very pertinent to how we should be working perhaps differently from a completely different angle. So in the mid-1990s, I worked for a biotech company in California that discovered the technology, invented the technology that, the molecular technology that allowed for the discovery and detection of the HIV virus. And in 4 or 5 years, I witnessed an unbelievable change in the way medicine was practiced. So the discovery of the virus and the ability to measure it changed the relationship between doctors and patients, changed the way clinical trials were done, changed the way various drug agencies approved and reimbursed products, and had a really profound way at how different kinds of doctors collaborated and the kinds of people that were involved in solving this very intense crisis. And the reason I bring that up is I think that's really what's needed on a built environment level as well. It's a field very much dominated by architects, engineers, and landscapers. And if we work with these three groups in a very traditional way, we'll always find the same old answers to the same problems. And so what I'm very fascinated by is who do we bring into the mix to ask the unusual question that will break apart the silo. And so be it psychologists, be it nutritionists, be it travel experts, be it any kind of new discipline that will force the old ways of doing things to ask new questions. And so I think that's a real need that we should drive. I think that's the fundamental skill of the sustainability expert, is to seek out that kind of expertise to bring NGOs and companies and cities and really create that new mix. So maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some examples later on, but I would say that's my opening salvo.
I was just about to say I'd love to come back and get some examples of that, Pascale. And I think it's not only the solutions that we're looking for in terms of who do we bring in, but how do we also reaffirm or reform rather the question itself, because I think that's another interesting area where we seem to be getting bogged down in, is it left or right, is it belief in climate change or not, and that there's a different way of asking that question, so I'd love to come back to that as well. Over to you, Rob, for your opening remarks.
Sure. Greetings from Portland, Oregon. I like to say that Portland is the sister city to Melbourne. You guys might not believe me, but for those of us who live in Portland, we see a strong kinship with this city and the approach that you've taken to livability, certainly streetcar, and the city's very smart move many years ago to retain some of its built environment and its infrastructure, and ultimately is sort of teaching the rest of the world, including Portland, just how important that infrastructure is for livability. I represent an organization called Ecodistricts, and as the name implies, we're passionate about the neighborhood scale as one of the significant opportunities to accelerate sustainability in cities. For years, I worked within municipal government, both for the city of Portland and also the city of Vancouver, BC. And I can say 14 years ago when I started this work, I entered into a very strange and lonely office, the Portland Energy office, to start this work on climate change. And there was about 6 people in this office, and we were doing sort of bizarre public-private partnerships with our local utility to execute on building efficiency programs and frankly having a very small impact in the work. So imagine 14, 16 years later, both as written, Pascale's remark, the sort of enormity of scale in which cities are taking this on and industry is taking on the green building and green cities movement is sort of staggering. And I think picking up on what Pascale was talking about around collaboration, when we unpacked the issues that we see driving the need for new models of infrastructure deployment, scalable building solutions at the neighborhood level, it really comes down to the lack of public-private partnerships and the governance models required to do this work. And as Rit was talking about the rapid deployment of technologies in cities, it's a good news story, but when you really unpack it, you're seeing sort of the low-hanging fruit sort of being deployed, building bike sharing systems, using innovative financing at the local level, sometimes using federal dollars to deploy those technologies. Doesn't take a lot of governance, but when you get into neighborhood scale development, you're talking about neighborhood councils, you're talking about city councilors representing local jurisdictions, you're talking about public agencies deploying some level of infrastructure and quasi-region state utilities deploying other pieces of the work, and then ultimately real estate and community developers doing the rest. It's a very complicated ecosystem. And what I look forward to getting into this conversation today is to talk a little bit about what the new models of governance need to be. A lot of the conversations, particularly in the U.S. in the last 8 years, have been around new finance mechanisms around infrastructure and building efficiency. I'm of the belief that it's not so much about the technology or frankly the financing. It's really about the public-private partnerships to knit these projects together to make sure that it's an understandable supply chain to do the work. And it's a really rich environment to work in, but it's very complicated. And frankly, it's a nut that we have to crack if we're going to accelerate this agenda even further.
Thanks, Rob. I couldn't agree more. I think one of the interesting projects which City of Melbourne is embarking on is how do we value environmental infrastructure and even putting a price on that. And I feel like those are conversations that I was having when we were in university, and that's many years ago now. How do we put a dollar value on those ecosystem services? But not only that, things like your tramcar network I know have had huge economic uplift for the businesses that surround them. And yet still when you go into cities and say that you're going to put in a new public transport network, there's all the naysayers who say it'll ruin streets and ruin businesses. So how do we get past that is an interesting question to touch on as well. Right. Thank you. Jane, your opening remarks, you get your lucky last here. You can sort of cherry pick some of those pearls of wisdom and tie them all together.
Thanks, guys. My accent's a little bit closer to yours, so hopefully you'll understand me a little bit more clearly. The Green Building Council movement started about 15 years ago with leaders from the property sector, a lot of developers and people that you maybe not, so aware that actually care about these issues, came together and said, hang on, let's look at our industry. We use about 50% of the raw materials that come out of the ground. We produce about a third of the carbon emissions that get put into the air through the use of the buildings. We use about 40%, sometimes 80% in cities of the energy that's produced in the country, somewhere around 20% of the wood that's harvested, and basically looked at the impact of our industry and we went, we know we can do better. And so there were groups called Green Building Councils where players and leaders from the industry came together and started looking at how we do better by ourselves and not just waiting for government, not waiting for enlightened politicians to come and say, actually, we do have a role to play here together. And so the green building movement has grown, as you heard before, to 100 countries now, having these organisations of industry leaders that look at how we can do better. And they've defined green building through voluntary rating systems that sit very separate to building codes. You know that building codes are very formal, they deal with health and safety issues, they connect to the regional plans, they deal with all of the, the hard issues that need to be covered by everyone. They do not set aspirational targets. They do not necessarily set aspirational energy efficiency targets. They certainly don't speak to climate change and to environmental impacts in a broader sense. And so the building industry has really taken it upon itself over the last 15 years to define this best practice green building, we're calling it, and looking at how we educate ourselves, how we upskill ourselves, how we work better, like Pascale said, to integrate the value chain and actually do a better job. I think we've made a great impact over the time. There are a higher concentration of green buildings, certified green buildings here in Melbourne than anywhere in Australia, so you guys are leading the way, so well done on that. But now we've realised that one building at a time is not enough. It's not going to solve our city issues. One building at a time is not going to talk to the issues that Rit talked about of connection, of all of the infrastructure. And so, I mean, us sitting here on a panel, of a diverse panel with politicians, this is the way of the future. This is how we now build on the capacity that we've built as industry leaders and connect to politicians and connect to the officials within government to look at, yes, how do we actually create the future we want? Another thing I think is important from our perspective, or one of the things that we do, is because we know that building codes are the minimum and the bottom that everyone has to meet if you're going to build a building, our role is also to cheerlead and champion increasing policy and making sure that the bottom line actually increases over time, and that there's a sort of level playing field for all of the industry players and standards increase over time. To really meet the innovation and change that's happening within industry. So we're kind of cheerleaders behind politicians that want to make progressive policy.
If it's one thing, Jane, that politicians like, that's a cheerleader. So you'd be very popular, I think. I think the opening remarks, they really do set the scene in terms of, I think, the magnitude of the problem, but also some of the potential solutions as well. And I think I agree with you completely that we've got quite a diverse set of experiences and also skills. And, you know, coming to Pascale's point that it really is going to take all these different types of people to bring not only change, but rapid change. Rit, I might kick off with you, but please, each of our panellists, jump in on this question, because I think it's the one that we're really wondering about. With bringing about significant change, what are some of the barriers to that change for cities, and how do we break down those barriers more quickly?
Well, I think the barriers that cities face are going to be no different than the barriers that a company or an individual would face, right? One of them, and you kind of touched on it, is simply the fear of change, right? And one of the things that strikes me is that when you start doing something, you get better at it. Right? There is a terrible fear. You're going to overstudy. Should we have a streetcar? Should we close this place to traffic? Should we implement this requirement for how buildings are done? Right? You overstudy it, and you realize, first of all, none of the projections are accurate because they don't take into account what you learn along the way. And it's much easier to give prominence to the downside than to the upside. Right? And we've seen this in New York when I led the sustainability office. People were worried about all sorts of things. That we mandated benchmarking and disclosure for building energy efficiency. In the United States, we don't have that as a national requirement, so this was quite groundbreaking. It was only us in Seattle that started this. And we had hours and hours of arguments about how the analysis was done and was it fair because, there are a couple of buildings in the city that have a television studio and those might not be treated fairly, so we shouldn't do the whole thing, was the position that some people were taking, right? And of course it turns out to be irrelevant, and a couple of buildings have an asterisk for a little while, and then it actually, you learn how to do the rating system to accommodate for that. And I've seen that in Times Square. There was a big uproar when Mayor Bloomberg proposed closing Times Square to traffic. Now everybody realizes it was a great idea. The new mayor quickly had a moment when he said, well, maybe we should revisit it, and the tide of public opinion convinced him otherwise that it wasn't even a question, because everything adjusts, and it turns out this was a great idea. And the biggest piece of evidence I have for this is that we in New York, are so far ahead of the targets we set for ourselves, right? And we thought those were pretty aggressive targets. But things got easier as we did them. And I think that's one of the key lessons. The other one is, however, the challenge of what powers you have, right? And here's one of the key differences around the world is that a city government does not have the same powers or the same jurisdiction as any other city government. New York, the mayor does not control the transit system. Even though the majority of New Yorkers blame him for it, they still don't. He doesn't actually control the transit system.
It's pretty good, Britt, compared to some transport systems.
Well, yes, but that kind of thing. So how do you develop an integrated plan when you don't have the full powers? You do develop the kind of partnerships that Rob talked about. These are some of the problems when you can't do something in an integrated way. When somebody's got a different boss, you're still trying to work together. It makes it a little more difficult. Ultimately, I think we globally need to constantly be questioning the allocation of powers from the local and the regional and the national level.
Isn't it beyond that, though? Isn't it budgets within, even at the city level? Like if you think of transport budgets versus building budgets versus health budgets, I mean, there's a lot of kind of, when we're trying to produce the kind of value case for doing something or the return on investment, there's often kind of the siloed nature of how we allocate budgets within cities seems to be a bit of a barrier as well.
That's a really good point. So with Plan YC, did you break that down in any way, those silos?
Well, I think we benefited from the fact that given that in New York the mayor has the primary authority to set the budget, it still must be approved by the council, but the way the balance of power works, it really is originated by the executive branch. We never really suffered from the idea, well, X percent of the budget goes to this and Y percent goes to that. So that wasn't the challenge. There were financial kind of budgetary things. So New York does not have any dedicated taxes. Everything goes into the general fund and then everything is reallocated out, which in some cases is a very good thing. In other cases was very difficult because we couldn't necessarily make the case that, well, this will pay for itself, so it should essentially be free, right? So I don't know. And then the overall availability of money is a constant challenge, but that's true around the world.
Rob, just following on from that scenario, I can't help but go back to the tram car stuff because I actually met your mayor at the Joburg conference, and I was talking to him, and sort of halfway getting through speaking to him, I realised that I'd actually seen a TV show on this whole thing about sort of the fight back, I guess, with putting these tram car networks. And it's the one thing that Melbourne has that people are very envious of our tram network is fantastic. Following on from sort of Ritt's observations, how do you, I guess, fight that, not in my backyard? How do you build the business case to actually get these sorts of initiatives to fruition?
Well, a lot of it's about, I think, language and value proposition. Portland was the first city to start to meet Kyoto protocols in the U.S., and not a word was ever mentioned about climate change. It was about a livability agenda. And Charlie Hales, who's our current mayor, was one of the sort of key champions in the 90s and early 2000s about building a more livable city, which was really about rehabilitating and reimagining the city as a more dense, mixed-use place in which we had a much richer mix of transit options, et cetera. And so, much of the agenda was predicated on, making good decisions for the citizens around a more livable city. And then ultimately the economics and how those arrangements to do projects came forward sort of followed. So the streetcar, as an example, didn't make sense from a lot of perspectives to spend that amount of money for a 3-mile tram line through the center of the city, in which already had very good transit access. But we didn't realize it was going to stimulate over $4 billion worth of new development in a part of the downtown that hadn't seen much development. Likewise, $1 million a year in the city of Portland now translates into a $90 million a year bike economy in Portland for very simple bicycle transportation infrastructure. Much of that was work done by local advocates, cycling advocates, and others who were finding very creative ways to take very limited amounts of money to ultimately build something that's much beyond just a simple transportation option. It's about the culture of the city.
Did you know bikers are sick 1.5 days less per year than non-bikers.
And that makes any HR manager excited about the sustainability, I can assure you. It's
right, and I got to tell you that those statistics and that sort of data is proving out. But I have to say, it rarely moves the needle. Which is it's good data to sort of reinforce, but the issue that you raised about NIMBYism, I mean, it still takes us 2 years of public process to do 3 miles of lanes in a low density neighborhood, because we're talking about taking a few parking spots off the roads in Portland. And as one of my board members loves to say, sometimes you have to repress your democratic urges, something we do not do in Portland very well. We really express our democratic urges. And in New York, I don't know what the stats are, but the speed in which cycling has become a very serious endeavor in that city, which has got, I would imagine, much more difficult politics, and the pedestrianization is sort of staggering. So sometimes you just got to move, and then the economists will follow with the great data to sort of back us up. But rarely is that data sort of collected and used to sort of fight NIMBYism at the front end.
And it gets to why sometimes I get personally so frustrated, because I think it's so obvious that this solution is good for us, it's good for your health, it's often good for the bottom line. So why isn't it just being done? And I think we still, no matter how many times we prove, whether it be technology or public transport or any of these things, we're still fighting that situation of people not wanting their patch to be changed in any way, and that's a difficult one. Jane, how have you seen cities around the world, I guess, coping with that need to retrofit, I guess, existing infrastructure and make buildings greener? How do you sell that concept?
Well, I mean, we're sort of talking about barriers here as well. I think one of our challenges, and it's come up quite a lot over the last couple of days at the Green Cities Conference, is in our language. And this is why we're kind of excited to be here with you, because great, 500 of us can be in a room and we can talk about green buildings and all the technological advances and the number of square metres of green space. And we can talk about, technical things like, this air conditioning unit's got a new filter and it's got the 2002 microparticles, which improves this. But if we're not translating that to something that you understand, to say your kid will get less asthma, you'll get, one more day a year that you're not sick, and translating it into the great technical things we're doing, but how that benefits you in your lives, in your personal lives and in your work lives, and how you get around, then what we're doing and the work that we know we can do and getting the political support is a little bit harder. So that's why these conversations between the sort of technical experts and you as people in our community that we're doing this work for are so vital.
Yeah, I think you're right. My eyes started to glaze over as you were going through the numbers, and it's exactly the issue that I have, is that I think in the sustainability area, and this is an area that I've been in for 15 years. I'm now a politician. I don't wear that tag very easily, but in my other life, I work in education, environmental education. I think it's telling the personal interest story, trying to find what moves people inside that has far more impact than number of tonnes of CO2 emissions saved. Pascale, with a building, how do you tell that, I guess, personal interest story? How do you change this to be about livability and less about whether you're green or you're black or whatever colour you want to be? How do you change that into a personal interest story?
So I agree. Don't talk about CO2 and kilowatt hours, and instead talk about the role of fresh air and natural light in an office, or kids learn substantially faster in classrooms where there's fresh air and natural light. We did an interesting little study where we took two groups of about 18 youngsters in their mid-20s who worked at Deloitte's, and we put half of them in a room with no windows and no fresh air and no plants, and the other half in a beautiful room with sunlight, fresh air, and lots of green. And they had to underline the letter B in this magazine article, and they had to answer some very basic multiple choice questions. And the difference in the results was incredible. 20% faster, 19% more accurately. And so if you could translate that on a much broader scale, which CEO or office manager or mayor wouldn't be interested just in the pure well-being and productivity? So we need to move away from measurement and all the things we can't do and all the don't eat meat, don't fly, don't do all these things, and instead talk about health, well-being, healing, restoring, all these kinds of things that I just think are much more real things.
And I think too, again, if you look at why did some of our biggest organisations want to locate down to Docklands, it's because they could build buildings which were 5 or 6 star, and what they knew was obviously that was good for their branding and their image, but they knew it was also good for their staff health and well-being, and that was greater productivity, so that all of these things actually had an economic uplift as well as an environmental reduction in terms of impact. So I think I agree with you. I think it's these, how do we tell these personal interest stories? We still need the robust data for when we're sitting in a council chamber trying to make a decision about where funding should go. But what ultimately moves everyone else, including ourselves, is those personal interest stories. I'm going to change tack a little bit from personal interest stories to money. Because I think one of the other difficult thing is trying to get the money to pay for these things, even though they do have these fantastic returns, whether it's light rail or green buildings. People still say, well, how much is it going to cost me, instead of looking at the full life cycle analysis. Rid, I want to come back to you on this because not only because I Wikipedia'd Mike Bloomberg's bank account, and he's a very wealthy man. So I think
he and I together were worth billions.
I think that experience from having two of the world's more conservative businessmen in Bloomberg and Rockefeller now throwing big amounts of money at climate change and adaptation. What role does private investment play in building green cities? How do city councils, governments unlock that private investment to turn our cities green?
Well, I mean, we've got a couple of people here who have even done more of it, so I'll defer to them after just one observation, which is that at the end of the day, almost everything in a city is built with private capital, right? If you look at the whole city as a unit, the buildings, the furniture in the buildings, the things that we all have, these are all the components of the city, right? The government investment is relatively small. And I think if thinking about Pascale's point a little while ago about the holistic approach to things, and Rob's numbers about what small investments catalyze, it is the question of simply of how do you package that as a unit, right? Where government can make the investments that are appropriate for government that then lead directly and to those private investments. The trick is how do you link them? Because the fear is exactly kind of as you were talking about with the Portland example. We're going to spend all this money on the light rail, and what if nothing follows, right? So that's the fear. So the only real question is, how can you link those two so you know it's a good investment? And the final trick would be, can you develop the mechanisms to capture that so you can enable the government investment in the first place?
Any other reflections? I think because it's that I agree with you completely, Rid, is that ultimately, what government puts in, even to infrastructure or any sort of the fabric of the city, pales into insignificance when you look at the private investment. Obviously, we've got regulatory levers that we can set. We've got policy. We've got standards. I think the mandatory disclosure of neighbours rating has been a fantastic thing in Australia. And it's meaning that the commercial sector is actually striving for greener buildings without too much pushing from us. What else can we do?
I mean, I think the way Rich just framed it is really, really important, because the conversation, particularly in the U.S., doesn't sort of fall that way. It often is about sort of the government spending bad, good money after bad, and it doesn't add up to anything. When government sort of is being as effective as possible is unleashing private capital in a way that helps to, in essence, extend that capital further and further, so that those investments are protected and ultimately there's a good, solid return on that. I think there's sort of an intriguing movement, I think it's quite small in the U.S., about sort of categorizing public investment and being able to capture a return on that public investment to be invested as sort of angel capital, and so that we're thinking strategically when we invest these small amounts of dollars that they will have a return, and that ultimately you start to bring more market discipline to some of those investments, and trying to understand, which we've got good data and the ability to understand what those investments ultimately can reap. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. Certainly in the U.S., cities are becoming increasingly burdened with the need to spend, to be sort of the first option to build infrastructure. It used to be the federal government, for instance, used to build a majority of our wastewater treatment facilities and stormwater facilities in the U.S. It's no longer the case. Portland now has the second highest stormwater rates in the country because we just spent $1.5 billion fixing a combined sewer overflow problem. And so that's a challenge for local government to, in essence, to be writing the first checks and ultimately trying to figure out what those investments are, to have private utility companies, for instance, follow to extend that early investment and ultimately keep costs as low as possible.
So isn't the skill you're describing is one where you need to have the expertise to understand really well how government works? You need to understand how to write applications or how to influence how legislation is done, so that those kinds of things can be driven towards the correct, the desired outcome.
How much is the private sector thinking about how to, if you like, not so much influence government, because we know after every election the men in black suits are up in Canberra doing their thing, but how much is, some of our big developers, how much are you thinking about how you can work with local government to make our cities greener?
So I think that's one of the key topics we talked about in the last couple of days. Is if I take the example of the project I'm working on in London, where our ambition was to capture, to not waste any rainwater, to capture all the rainwater and then have it flow into a natural bioswale. So no underground storage tanks, no pipes. Well, we had to change the way the planners thought about inner city swales, and the best way to do that was to take them to a city where that already worked. And so this is a great example of networking various cities together and understanding how to get that story across.
I think that stormwater one's a really interesting one, because we've just had a new amendment passed where any development over 50 square metres now has to fulfil a number of stormwater requirements, which is as much about retention on the development as it is about filtering and less nutrients flowing out. But it wasn't too long ago that I remember in Melbourne that it was actually, you had to get a permit to put up a water tank in the driest inhabited continent in the world. So I think that sometimes, I guess the message there is that there are these planning scheme mechanisms which city governments can implement, but that we also shouldn't get disheartened about feeling like the rate of change is glacial, because you only have to sort of look back 10 or 20 years and the conversations are changing rapidly. Jane, again, in your sort of walk of life, how have you seen the conversations changing in terms of green infrastructure? Because I feel like there's been quite a major change, even in the last couple of years, in the private sector, and that in many respects we're now seeing nation states lagging behind the private sector in terms of how they're pushing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Often business says, look, they need help and incentives from government to change their business model and to get over that kind of early adopter phase. And I think Melbourne did a good job initially in funding some of the early green buildings. And then once the kind of capacity is built up within an industry, it reaches a tipping point where it's profitable and it's marketable and it's not this kind of niche business anymore. I mean, Peter Verwer had a stat in his closing thing, Romley, today, said something like, 8 years ago there were 900 solar units in the region, and now there's something like 260,000 or something. So, you look at just the uptake of 2.5 million. So, the uptake of solar, at first people thought it was a fringe technology. How are we going to manage it? We need government incentives. Now pretty much any new home that'll be built will have solar because the technology makes sense. So this kind of the inertia that's involved for business can be helped by government. Short-term, time-limited investments and getting over that sort of early market transition, I think, is a good role for government to play. But then, a lot of these things, business figures out themselves. Business is good at communicating with the public. Once the public have the right information and that dynamic and that kind of virtuous circle unfolds, change happens quickly.
And this might be a very obvious question, and I might sort of regret asking it. I think with the solar, that's a really interesting one for me, because I've got a 4.3 kilowatt system on my roof, and it's a little bit like the colour bond ad for me. I come home and sort of stand in the middle of the street and look at it, and I've had a rough day at work, and I think, 16 kilowatt hours generated. Thank you for your hard work today. And I just think this idea, Thomas Edison talked about, grabbing the power of the sun, and I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. Is the private sector being frustrated in some ways by government? And if so, what levels of government are more frustrating to business at the moment?
Pascale?
No, I don't know. I was just thinking of something really important that you said. So you come home and you look at the solar panels, and I think a lot of the renewable stuff, solar panels, composting, understanding where energy comes from, understanding where waste goes, connects us far more with what is actually happening and what's actually important, and the role of nature in cities, for example. And so I think we could be at the cusp of some really important change also in how we fit into cities, and what this comment you made about looking at the energy that was generated, I think is really important. You worry about what the weather's going to be like. You worry, it doesn't just come out of a socket somewhere, right? And I think this kind of connection to our surroundings and appreciation for the role that nature plays, not just for the role as nature, but the way it cools a city or the way it stops flooding, and that's a really important component of the sustainable city that we've been talking about.
I love your answer for two reasons, because you definitely sidestepped the government question. But also, I think that connection with nature is an interesting conversation to have in a highly urbanised environment. Our urban forest strategy that we've got for City of Melbourne is about doubling the canopy cover over the next 20 years. Now, obviously, part of that is Melbourne's amenity is our parks and gardens, and we're known for it around the world. We went through 12 years of drought, and it was a big wake-up call for us about the fact that we need to look at different ways of capturing water, not just to conserve water and lose this great green infrastructure that we have. But in having that conversation, people are very happy to say, yes, we need more trees, this is fantastic, please plant more trees in our city, until that tree is planted out the front of their house, and then you have some more interesting conversations. How do we... because ultimately, if you make a city good for people, a city is a good city, but often it's about what sort of buildings you're going to stick in that city is the first question is asked. How do we make our cities more organic? It's a bit of a naff term, but how do we get them more in touch with nature?
Let me answer that one and answer your other question about
Good. I'm glad, Jane.
Politicians. Good. So let's just look at Singapore.
I'll be taking notes on this one too.
Singapore 30 years ago looked at how they would transition from a third world city to one of the leading cities in the world. I mean, they're a country, but they're a city. There's 5 million people there now. The first thing that the Prime Minister did there was plant trees. I don't know if you've been to Singapore for the last few years, but those trees now are very beautiful. They provide shade. They're one of the things that makes Singapore a very attractive place. So when they had little money, they started off with planting trees, and the reason was because it made people start to love their city. It made people connect to the long-term vision that was there, that the Prime Minister had, and that took 30 years to roll out. So coming back to the other question, one of the challenges is short-termism of politics. These issues are long-term issues, and when we have short election cycles, when we're flip-flopping on from left to right and, Republican to, whatever we're going to call it, but these issues are long-term issues, and when we can have some of these topics that are non-politicised, then we'll be making progress.
I couldn't. I'm a politician, and I couldn't agree more with you. I think, when you're talking about the sustainability, the term itself is a long-term term, and the Lord Mayor likes to relate this story about when Melbourne took the most livable city crown off Vancouver, and he texts the Mayor of Vancouver at midnight just to let him know that we'd taken the crown because he thought that he would like to know. I had the pleasure of actually meeting the Mayor of Vancouver at the C40 summit, and I confirmed that story with him. That was my first order of business. But I think, when you look at livability, livability actually has a time base on it, because you don't remain the most livable city if you're also not one of the most sustainable cities. One of the biggest frustrations I have at the moment is the Metro 1 rail project, which you may or may not have heard of, but essentially it's 5 new underground stations for our city. It's Infrastructure Australia's #1 project, and yet it has been turned into a political football, with one side of politics saying we support it, the other side saying we're not so sure about it. With that major infrastructure investment, do you have any examples in your parts of the world, or indeed your travels, where that major infrastructure question can be taken out of those political cycles? And if the answer is no, that is fine too.
That's a tough one.
I think the only things that are actually big projects that are done by consensus are so long overdue and in such dire straits that you don't want to emulate that approach. For better or for worse, right? Contention is part of democratic governance, right? And so for the countries around the world that rely on democracy, you're always going to have those debates. I think what I take away on the question of infrastructure, to me it's a very similar dynamic as several of the other things we were talking about. The financing, the question of how you convince people to take that somewhat leap of faith, because fundamentally it's about desire. What is it that people want? And I'm actually a little bit skeptical about the argument that it's a lack of financing that holds back fill in the blank, right? It's not. I mean, there's nothing that we're really talking about that the collective society of New York City or Melbourne or the United States of America or Great Britain cannot pay for. It's the question of what are we willing to pay for, and how directly are we willing to face what it costs, and what we're currently paying for, are we willing to face how much those things cost, right? And so a middle-class household, if they want a swimming pool, chances are they'll find a way to finance it, right? They don't sit around in a building in the commercial market that feels the need to upgrade its lobby or its facade. You'll find the financing, right? So the question is, how do we make green so desirable that you go out and find the financing? I think Neighbors is doing that. Certainly that was the theory behind mandating benchmarking in New York City, and I think we're seeing the impact of that. But it is also around, are you willing to make the leap, willing to make the sacrifices, willing in some cases to put up with the fact that there are going to be people who don't like the decision, there are going to be losers, right? You can't, somebody is deriving benefit from too much free parking, right? It's a lot of people who own cars, who maybe when faced with the cost of what it really costs to store that car in an urban environment, it wouldn't be worth it anymore, right? So that's a choice. You're taking away something that they're getting for free and reallocating it to a higher purpose, right? And so the question then is, does the collective democratic society, through the procedures so you don't violate, a minority's rights, but are you able to push change? And that's about, does the society agree on a broader vision, right? No company makes a strategic shift that's all about what the accountants and financial projections say. It is about the vision of a leader. It's true about a city. It's true about a nation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would just to add to that, most, I think, good decisions often were not followed by a lengthy consensus building sort of effort. And frankly, in the U.S., 40 years, 50 years of sprawl building didn't start with a conversation about should we build sprawling exurbs and suburbs. It just was done. It was done by decision makers making decisions with infrastructure dollars. Likewise, in green infrastructure, again, going back to stormwater, those were decisions made by a utility to be very practical about how are we going to solve issues, and it turned out the green infrastructure was less costly, but not after spending a lot on gray infrastructure to get to that point where we could do the economics properly, and we could convince, in our case, the federal EPA that it was, we could figure out how to do green infrastructure and get the same results. And that, bicycle, whether it's bicycles in New York or bicycles in Portland, likewise, we didn't have a big conversation about bicycling. Some decision makers started building infrastructure. What's interesting sometimes, though, is when things become successful, and again, Red said this, there's going to be losers, and there's also going to be sort of conversations that get, kind of out of whack. In Portland, for example, bicycling is becoming a conversation around gentrification, particularly in historic African American communities in which many of the citizens are responding very negatively to bike lanes because they see it as a tool of gentrification, part of the conversation they were not invited into, and they don't see themselves bicycling around. Sometimes these conversations become very odd, and you have to stand firm in what that infrastructure is doing, and ultimately broaden the conversation, but not to start the investments. I think to ultimately scale the investments. That's where the conversation's
I'm glad you mentioned bike lanes, because they are one of the fun topics for the City of Melbourne, and you can be guaranteed you can do a million things, and then you try and put a bike lane across Prince's Bridge, and you get 6 weeks of front page coverage on the Herald Sun. So it's an interesting one. We're going to open to questions in just a moment. So just get your hands up ready to go, and we'll have the roving mic come over to you. Just while we're getting those roving mics ready, just a really quick one, 2 or 3 things. We'll start with you, Jane. So I'm sorry you don't get the time to think of your 2 or 3 things. 2 or 3 things that a green city absolutely can't not have. It has to have these things. What are they, these 2 or 3 things that a green city must have?
Lots of green buildings, public transport and trees.
Good.
Lots of fun.
Oh yeah, coffee.
Access for all, so they can share in the opportunities. And awesome neighbourhoods, walkable, awesome neighbourhoods.
Right, so it's about equity as well, though, Rob?
Yeah.
Pascale?
Clean air, proximity to walkability or permeability, and no congestion. And maybe my third one would be lots of nature.
I think you say windsurfing.
Yeah, in a city.
I could see that on the arrow. Yeah. Red?
Well, so much has been said already. I'll just add one, which is, I think, a sense of place, because that becomes the guiding principle around which you build everything else. So what is it, as much as cities are similar, New York has a sense of, we're New York, we're not Chicago, we're not London, right? And London clearly has an identity of itself and what it values, and Melbourne does as well. And I think that's what anchors the notion of making a city better, is we know what's good about it today. Yeah,
it's why our audience has turned up tonight, because I think that sense of place in Melbourne is alive and well. The other thing too is that it's really interesting that you've brought that up, because that's also an Indigenous concept. That sense of place, whether it was knowing that rock or that river, and that sort of idea of being one with the world. I think that's something in cities which we're seeing now with some of these smarter green buildings, that they're starting to introduce that fact that you can smell the air, you can see water flowing through the grounds, and I think that's actually important to our psyche and our well-being, and ultimately our health, and that's a much bigger question that we need to be having as well. Okay, questions. We've got our roving mic, Michelle. We've got our first question, just your name and your question, and you're welcome to direct it to a panellist.
I just wanted to suggest to the panellists that the first thing we should have is a vision for Melbourne. Melbourne City Council has registered Sustainable Melbourne as a brand name for part of its operation, and it seems to me that given the absence of vision in Australia at the present time, and given the logic of Melbourne taking a lead role and being a model for other cities in Australia and elsewhere, that we should take advantage of the perception of us, and also the fact that wherever you go, whether it's Melbourne Town Hall or whether it's Melbourne University, they're packed out with people. We should really have an opportunity to put a motion to the council that they adopt Sustainable Melbourne as a way in which we unite underneath a banner, something which provides an alternative to business as usual.
And your question?
I wonder what you think of that idea.
Great, well done. Very well handled. So uniting behind a common vision and obviously residents having a say under that vision. Your thoughts?
I don't know if you've ever seen photographs. I think it's the World's Fair in 1930-something in New York, where they had people walking through these models of high-rises and superhighways, and they were describing the vision of the car and mobility and sleek steel engine, you know, all that kind of stuff. And they did paint a vision of what happened in the last 50 years. And I really resonate with what the gentleman said. We don't have today this really positive vision of, imagine if you lived in a really energy efficient, smaller home with a green roof and you didn't need a car and whatever it all is. We haven't packaged that yet the way the consumer world packages all the other stuff for us. And it's really, we're really missing that.
And I think the word you use in terms of packaging it up, I think that's the key. I think elements of that vision are being sold, but it's this fact that this is all interlinked, that if you have a healthy house, you have a healthy person, that if you introduce bike lanes, you have less obesity perhaps. You know, those sorts of, I guess, more packaged narratives are a little bit disjointed at the moment. So I think something that we can sell much better and more holistically. Next question.
As proponents of green buildings, if you were asked to do a major urban renewal project, say about 250 hectares, what sort of building typology would you recommend? Would it be tower blocks on podiums, or would it be 5, 6, 7-storey buildings, or something else?
Yeah, great question.
Interesting. That debate played out in Vancouver, BC, when I was living up there for the Olympic Village. That's, if you're familiar with Vancouver, it's a podium. In fact, the sort of podium was invented, the sort of skinny podium was invented in Vancouver through a sort of a wrinkle in the building code. It became very popular because, from real estate perspective, it allowed for view and light to be protected, and those views, which were worth a lot, to be protected. Well, fast forward 10 years after that podium had been built hundreds of times over, they came to the conclusion they would rather have more of a European-style footprint, 5 to 7 stories, kind of like Washington, D.C., or many cities in Europe, where your zero lot line and you're sort of denser on the block, and ultimately your density is much higher than the podium. So some cities are having that debate, like Vancouver, and then they have opted into the future to go more European. That's my belief as well. As we, you know, in cities like Portland that are quite low density by most city standards, you need to really crank up the density, zero lot lines on particularly on the transit centers. Try to protect housing inside if you have some single family. But really the high streets become more European in nature.
It's a very timely question, and I think our gentleman asked this with that in mind, is that we have 2 major renewal areas in Fisherman's Bend, and obviously Docklands is a bit further along the scale. Is there much, you know, Jane or Pascale, done in the way of how many people can you fit in more medium density scale development compared to very tall buildings?
So we, with the help of our friends from the Green Building Council, recently did a workshop where we tried to understand what constitutes a sustainable tower. So how can you replicate in a tower many of the things that you have, say, on a street? And the discussion very quickly moved from the design of the building to, for example, what kind of data management can you do? As you walk into the lobby, can you project certain things where you can create a sense of community and a sense of you know, the feel of a smaller scale home? So can you use, for example, data management as a way to stimulate people who have similar interests? Can you then link what's happening in the lobby to information that's sent up to each of the various units? So it's a really, really interesting question. I don't think there's a magic formula that says it's better to be high-rise or low-rise, but how do you create community in either setting, I think, is the important answer, or the important question.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, and I know there's some interesting examples in Asia where they don't have the option for doing anything but high-rise because of the urbanisation and the huge demand on getting people into big cities. And they're looking at options of connecting high-rises together, having actual public space that, you know, enables people to run and walk and have trees and have kind of communal space within a high-rise. And we don't see that here. So when we think of high-rise, we think of separate buildings, not particularly flexible in terms of the nature of use. But I think there's a whole new kind of imagination of what a high-rise could be and what could constitute, you know, the levels and what could happen on the different levels. So I think there's some interesting things happening up there.
And it's interesting because, and I think the point you're making is it's not either one or the other. There is good development and there's dumb development, and that, you know, even high-rise with the right setbacks and the right design and all those sorts of things and how it interacts with the streetscape can actually be at a human scale, even though it's quite a tall building. So it's an interesting conversation to have.
Question about the property market. Melbourne's seen a huge boom in residential property developments recently. Any investment by a developer in making an apartment sustainable, insulating and renewable energy, etc., that gets passed on to the user as reduced costs. But we haven't seen much of an effect on the property value. Is there hope out there? Do you have information about sustainable residential apartment buildings actually having a higher property value? And what can you suggest that we can do to intercept that, to increase the value?
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. So in the UK, in the last 3 years, energy prices have risen by 20%. So let's just imagine that continues, maybe not at the same rate, but continues for the next 10 years. Any home that deals with that situation in a better way will be more valuable. The same is true for water. The same is true for any kind of sustainable feature. So I'm very, very convinced that as things get more extreme, I think the value will play out in an even stronger way.
I think one of the things that rating tools do is that they try and define that value so it's saleable. So if you look at a 5-star, Green Star office building, they know that it's worth more and it's certified and it's third-party verified. And so that value can be on-sold because it has this verification. Like your organic banana, it costs a little bit more, it's got the label on it. So a labelling system that says that this is beyond code and it's got these features is a communication device between the buyer and the seller. So we need to see more actual third-party labelling of homes, and that will help that conversation occur. We have the CEO of the Australian of the Australian Green Building Council here. She can talk to this.
Welcome our new panel member.
Yes. Hi, Romilly Majew, CEO, Green Building Council of Australia. You're absolutely right. It was the office market that moved first. And there is a Green Building Index, IPD, run it, so it's independent of the Green Building Council and neighbours. And what they've seen is that there is a higher return on investment on green buildings, office buildings. And the reason being is the take-up in the office buildings has been faster. That take-up is now happening in the multi-unit residential tool. It is our second fastest moving tool. And so what you'll find is that value add of both the asset and then the building will start increasing. We're also doing some consumer awareness work because we're very aware that the asset of an office building is very different than of a residential tower because you've got so many multiple owners in a tower. So we're working with an independent group to look at how we can show that value. They've done it very well in New York. There's some fantastic green LEED office buildings in New York, and people move into them because their kids have asthma and they know the indoor environment quality in that apartment building is so much better than if they're in a non-green building. So it's just catch up. The more green buildings we get, the more research we get and the more we're able to show value.
Thanks, Romilly. And
well, let me put a plug into the politician on the stage, because this is where the disclosure and local public policy plays a major role. I mean, it's one thing to have the investment, sort of those who make make major investments in real estate to start to move the market, but disclosure law and required energy performance is a game changer in the public policy realm as well.
Okay, so, and just thanks, Romilly, on that, and congratulations too on the Green Cities Conference this week. I think the other important thing is, you're exactly right, is what we're seeing in the city and through data that's coming in from the Property Council and even from some of our big building owners, is that if a building has a higher Green Star rating, what they're seeing is longer term tenancies. They're being able to charge a premium, and when you've got a big expansion of the CBD, with the mooted Fisherman's Bend, is you are seeing a competitive advantage for those green buildings now, which is hugely encouraging. In terms of the residential market, is you have got disclosure in the ACT. So I believe that's coming to a store near us very quickly, and what you will see is that on an advertising billboard for a house, you won't just see 3-bedroom, fantastic vanity, double car garage. You'll also see, and energy costs this much a year, water costs this much a year, and so you'll buy a house based on the life cycle of that. Hence, my 4.3 kilowatt system is adding extreme value to my house, which I'm very happy with. Our next question.
Just wondering, you mentioned Kyoto protocols and all that sort of thing, mainly to the councillor. Is it like Bridget Jones's diary where, I didn't lose weight this year, that's too bad? Or is there, like, in my job, if I don't meet the quota of whatever I have to meet, there's a consequence, like I might get fired, or it might be a fine, like Yarra Trams didn't meet their targets?
It's a very, very great question. I think there is an ultimate judge, and it's called, if you run out of air quality and water quality, that's a kind of a very worrying judge of whether we get this right or not. The question, I guess, though, and I might come to you in terms of New York's experience here, is Kyoto, Copenhagen, all these sort of more international agreements seem to sort of come and then they go. Do they have much influence on cities and how they go green, or do we just keep getting on and rolling up our sleeves?
Well, I think, so leaving aside the international and national targets, I think the question that I would encourage you to think about is the role that public target setting plays in the local government, right? And ultimately, there's no way to enforce a policy if the public isn't willing to hold the leadership accountable, right? So one of the things that we've stressed at C40 is annual carbon emission reports from our cities, publishing the data, making sure that as long as there's a public and advocacy group, whatever, in a given city, that it is equipped to at least let its citizens know whether the city is meeting its targets or not. Because ultimately, and this is where some of the international negotiations fundamentally break down, is you can't penalize someone who is sovereign by definition, right, for not doing their job. That's what sovereignty implies. If the people are fundamentally sovereign, then the people are the only people who can discipline themselves, right? And the only way to do that is through full disclosure. To get back to Bridget Jones, it's a question of how public was that weight loss target, right? And if it's only a commitment you make to yourself, those are, of course, the easiest ones to let yourself off on. But the ones you scream from the rooftops, you lose a lot of face if you don't follow through.
I like that point you make about Bridget Jones, because
I'm impressed,
Are we sort of showing our softer side here, Red? I'm not sure. There's sort of two ways to go about it, isn't there? There's the stick and the carrot, and the stick says, if you don't meet your targets, you're a bad person. I think the carrot is, if Bridget meets her weight loss targets, then she's actually a leader in her field. And what I see is, particularly with climate change and climate adaptation, is there's huge risks if you don't get it right. But on the flip side of that, there's huge opportunities for the first movers, just like in any technology race. So I think, keeping an eye on the opportunities as well as the regulatory mechanisms is really, really important. And that's why I think the alternative energy space is so interesting. Over 1 million rooftops now with solar panels, and all those people vote. So there's some interesting decisions for people to make when they're considering sustainability, if it directly translates to whether they're staying in government or not, and that's a direct pressure that you can actually put on. Pascale?
Perhaps just to add to that, so the opposite of what Rich just said is a couple of years ago in Germany, they made the decision to move away from nuclear energy, and Germany has never fired up more coal power plants than it has in the last 2 years, and has now reached record levels, the highest ever in the history of Germany, levels of CO2 emissions. And France probably has a very different track record, but the question is which of those two technologies do we trust in the most, and which is the better or the less worse of those two choices? So it's very tricky, and things happen along the way that then derail these carbon targets in a brutal way.
Next question.
We understand the effect on livability of urban heat islands, and we also understand the benefit you can get from cool roofs. Why do you think cities are so slow at the mandating of cool roof technologies in their building controls?
I could answer that, but I'm going to throw to our panellists and then maybe just do a little bit on the end. I'm trying to resist this. Jane, why aren't we moving more quickly on green roofs, facades, walls?
Because those buildings exist and they're owned by multiple different parties, it's very hard to influence a building once it's past building code. It's this whole dynamic we have around the existing building stock. It's very, very hard to get a building owner to act. Rit, you want to comment on this one?
Well, I think so. Perhaps being overly brusque, but I am a New Yorker. It's cowardice, right? I mean, fundamentally, what you're talking about is the need for whichever level of government in a given place has the authority to mandate it, to go ahead and do it, and to face those people who say, "Oh, it'll cost me a couple of bucks more." And frankly, when you're talking about a cool roof covering, it is literally a couple of bucks more. And yet, for whatever reason, passing that mandate that says you've got to do it over a certain amount of time, maybe it's not everybody has to do it next week, you do it over 5 years or 10 years or whatever, but you've got to do it, that ought to be mandated. We're moving towards that in New York. It's not that hard. And the thing that I keep coming back to is you wouldn't stand for it if it was about safety regulations, right? And one of the things we did in New York, in fact, is parallel some of our green building mandates for retrofitting buildings and modeled them on things that had been done in terms of retrofitting buildings for safety. So in New York, 10 years ago, finally, they mandated that all large buildings had to retrofit to get sprinkler systems installed in skyscrapers, right? Massively expensive if you think about what that means for a tall building. So it was done over, I think it was a 20-year compliance period, right? So buildings could build that into their normal maintenance cycle. Well, when we developed the requirements that buildings had to improve their lighting, they had to install sub-meters in commercial spaces, so commercial tenants were paying for what they used. We modeled it on that. So it's the same kind of phase-in that they did, and that helped the building industry deal with it and understand it. But fundamentally, some of this stuff, you just say, you got to do it. It's unacceptable not to.
Yeah, just to pick up on it, it's political. It's the lack of this industry's political appetite to do policy making. We're about technology. We're about trying to reduce the cost and ultimately convince the market one consumer at a time to make a decision. And public policy requires political muscle and alliances that, frankly, this industry hasn't have a lot of experience in putting together. I can tell you when we did rainwater harvesting, we fought the plumbing union in Oregon, and that was a very difficult union to fight because they're in talking to the legislature every day about all kinds of things. They're also the ones who got residential fire sprinklers required because it's not primarily from a safety issue. It's from it's more pipe. So you got to figure out those. You got to figure out those alliances. You got to work the politics, and I think this is an area that the green building industry is just lagging compared to some other industries. So if we just hang our hat on sort of technology transfer and bringing costs down as the mechanism. You know, in Portland, we talk about this all the time. We have to convince 300,000 homeowners to make a decision, a net present value decision about insulating their home and, you know, figuring out if they should get an Energy Star heater or not. That's a lot of flipping decision makers we gotta require, versus a disclosure initiative or a required set of performance metrics at the time of sale. You know, we could be waiting a long time to get that net present value conversation started in the city versus rolling up our sleeves and having a policy discussion in lieu.
The most extreme example I know of that is a friend of mine works at Marks and Spencer's, a food retailer, and half of their energy use in stores comes from refrigeration, but there's such a reluctance to put glass doors on the refrigerators because 1% less people than buy the orange juice or grab the milk, and it just seems, again, to Ritt's point, it's up to us. It's about the people who then say, well, we demand that or we want that, and not let it be driven only by people who measure success only in footfall and number of cartons of milk that is sold. So it seems such a trivial thing, but it's almost an impossible obstacle to overcome.
And I think we're fast. I could talk all night on these topics. We're fast reaching the end of the session, but I do want to just give a quick plug because it's very timely that just last month we launched the Growing Green Guide for the City of Melbourne. It was actually a partnership of inner Melbourne councils, and that Growing Green Guide is one small key in terms of greening facades, roofs and walls, in that it actually shows you how to do it, species selection, how to actually construct them, what sort of reinforcement do you need on your roofs, because one of the big issues with green roofs is people want them, but many of our existing buildings simply can't actually hold a green roof. So then you might suggest a white roof, which is far less expensive, still actually reflects a lot of the heat and drives down those energy costs. So I think we've talked a lot about how do we bring about change tonight. And I think we've had a few great examples of that. You know, whether it's Plan YC, whether it's, you know, retrofitting the tram cars in Portland, whether it's the green building councils coming together to show tenants, building owners, the construction industry that green buildings are not only better for people and better for the environment, but they're better for your economy in the long run is really important. I want to thank you as the audience for coming along tonight. I think, you know, it's an absolute privilege to have you come along and listen to us tonight, but I also want to thank our panel members who I've enjoyed your time up here immensely. Rit, you've just been so giving of your time over the whole week that you've been here. I've said that Rit manages jet lag far better than I do. When I was in Johannesburg, I was sort of mumbling different sorts of language when I first met him. But your time over this week has been fantastic. Pascale, your insights have been great. And I think too, Rob, you know, what Portland's doing is really quite inspirational, because if it can be done in Portland, if it can be done in Melbourne, it can be done in many cities around the world. And Jane, obviously the work of the Green Building Councils is just vital in terms of getting that message out there. So please join with me in thanking our panel tonight for their time.